of the census. The first half is that portion where people are mailed questionnaires to their home and they return them filled out, hopefully. The second half of the census is one where we knock on the doors of those houses where people have not done that. And the results from last night say that we're 98% through with that process, which is knocking on 47 million households' doors throughout the country, with about 500,000 to 600,000 enumerators. So that process is close to being finished. We won't be out of the field when that is over. We begin, believe it or not, 2 or 3 other operations that are focused not on adding to the counts necessarily, but making sure that the quality of the data meet our standards. So, for example, starting in July, the houses that we're now calling on, where people judge that they are currently vacant or were vacant on April 1st, we're going to go back to every one of those houses and just make double sure that we have coded those correctly. So to houses where we've directed someone to knock on the door and they go out to the neighborhood and they literally cannot find that address. It appears to be an error on our list. We'll double check those as well. Then there'll be a later operation where we address those complicated household compositions where some people may live there only temporarily, or we've received a form where it isn't quite clear what address it should be attached to, and we'll double check those. And then we'll go quiet for a few months as we're processing these data. The processing step looks for any duplicates within the large data set we have, roughly 309 million people. And then on December 31st, we will deliver to the president the counts at a state level. So that's about where we are. Why don't I stop and just field questions?
In your talk a little while ago, you contrasted the minority growth basically from 1980 to, I guess, a majority in 242.
Yep.
What about contrasting it to the great waves of migration back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, where my sense is that there was a lot of similarities and some differences?
Yeah. I mean, this country, as they say, truly is a nation of immigrants. We built the country that way. And if you study the patterns of immigration throughout the decades, it is common to see parts of the world contributing disproportionately to new immigrant groups. So we had early Western Europeans, followed by Eastern Europeans, and now Asians, and those from Central and South America. That will continue. I think what's different about this immigration, as I said in my talk, is that while earlier waves of immigration really hit the East Coast and the West Coast, people arrived across the oceans, the new immigration from Central and South America has affected the Southwest in new ways. So just geographically, it looks different. And then I think with the development of transportation systems and the assistance of social and religious organizations settling new immigrants, the immigration appears to be heavily dispersed throughout the country. It's less clumped on the coast, as it were, and as it was in previous decades. And so you see little towns, really small towns, that we might think are quite homogeneous on race and ethnicity, having clusters of Asian groups living in there in ways that I think is counter to our stereotype. And that's a phenomenon that I think the 2010 census will tell us in more stark ways than we now understand it.
Thank you. Actually, I have a couple of questions. One is just a point of information. You said when you receive a questionnaire by mail, it's 44 cents. What did you say it was for a personal interview? $70?
You know, these are hard numbers to get exactly.
Roughly. It was
Our
over-
estimate is that a household that received the questionnaire by mail and then returns it by mail, fills it out and returns it, that act of mailing it and receiving it is about a 42 cents taxpayer load on it. If, in contrast, they don't do that, and then we follow up with a paid enumerator, on average, that's about $57 per household, about $25 per person. There's roughly 2.3 people per household in the US. So that contrast, that ratio, knowing that ratio, you know a lot about the cost structure and what you would want to do in a census. If you want to reduce the cost of the census, it's crystal clear what to do. If you get people to return the questionnaire by mail or do it without that intervention of a paid, trained enumerator, you can save lots of money. We think for every 1 percentage point of the households that return the questionnaire, we save $85 million versus sending people out. So if you then say, well, how could you encourage them to do that? We chose advertising and forming alliances with groups throughout the country, these so-called partner groups. And that appeared to stem the tide of declining response rates. You know, being in this field, that our survey response rates are going down at between 1 to 2 percentage points a year, steadily, despite all of our efforts. This society is reacting to a survey request by saying, no, I'm not really interested, at ever-growing rates. The fact that this same society returned 72% of the questionnaires in 2010 and 2000 is just remarkable. I lost a lot of bets, I can tell you, on this result. So I'm paying up my friends that I didn't think we'd do it. And this is not a testament to the excellence of the Census Bureau. I think it's really to these partners who there are some partners who went door to door. In Houston, one group put 150,000 door hangers on every door in the city. And they said, you know, fill out that form. It's good for Houston. People had festivals. All sorts of things happened without being paid to do that. And that's the real, it's going to be hard to prove this in a scientific way, but my judgment is this made the difference because a lot of people had a trusted voice in their neighborhood or their ethnic group saying, you know, you ought to do this. This is good for our group. Fill out that form. And that beat all the advertising we could buy. I think it was just much more powerful that, you know, person-to-person relationship worked.
Just a comment, you might be pleased to know I've come across both the diary, which I filled in my regular apartment in the city, but I also had a young lady knocking on my door in my country home, and I explained, I don't know how you're going to do that. And she said, no, we have a way to do that, and you were already counted, and we don't expect you to be counted again, and which I thought was very good. So she received good training, so congratulations.
Well, it's good to hear when it works right.
Yeah, it worked fine.
Doesn't always work right, I must admit.
The other thing relates to my, I'm a great fan of scenario planning, and the census plays a very large role in what I do. So I have a question about, you mentioned in 2042, we're going to have an ethnic majority. What does it mean? Who are those people? Are they mostly Hispanic? For instance, one of my projections, it's not a projection, it's one of the scenarios that's possible, is that in 2050, and I've said it, 2 or 3 years ago, Congress may pass a law making Spanish the language of the land. If we get a majority or close to a majority, a plurality of Hispanics, they might insist on that because that's the mindset of Hispanics. You got to have a national official language. We don't have an official language. So we might pass one and we might all be, by 2060, if I'm alive, be speaking Spanish. Am I totally off here?
I have no idea whether you're off
so-
or on. The forecasting business, what is it, a Yogi Berra thing? That forecasting is a difficult thing, especially when you're talking about the future.
Yes.
Something like that. You know, this is tricky stuff. So the data I showed you in that talk, take the vital registration system, take births and deaths,
Yeah.
take fertility rate data, and project forward that stock of the people. So we know how people age. They age 1 year at a time. That's very nicely done. You have to make some estimates of emigration and immigration. That's the trickiest part. So those kind of forecasts assume current patterns of those phenomenon projected forward. If the fertility rate changes radically across those groups, that could change the estimate. If mortality changes, if immigration or emigration changes, then those forecasts are subject to errors. They are forecasts with those assumptions. Your speculations about what now, I also showed you racial makeup of the population. And that led to this majority-minority kind of speculation about 2042. So with all those assumptions, the white non-Hispanic population becomes a minority at that trigger point, given the assumptions of the growth of the population, change of composition. How you characterize minority is key to those sorts of forecasts. And whether you want to count the white Hispanics as part of that minority or not depends on whether you're talking about race or race and ethnicity. Yeah. So whenever you're in a conversation about the future of racial composition or ethnic composition, I think you really have to define your terms to make sure you're communicating with one another.
So what's going to happen in 2042 is what I don't understand.
Oh, in 2042, the white non-Hispanic population becomes a minority, becomes less than 50% of the population.
White
Non-Hispanic population.
less than 50%.
Yeah.
Professor, if I can take you out of your current role and maybe back to the teaching role where you may be sometime in the future. You guys got it now? Okay. Everything you've done on the statistic research part of the census, it's very impressive. But a really cool thing that's come to me that you've had an opportunity to do is that you've been the CEO, the CMO for a major product brand that has rolled out and had an opportunity to spend a bunch of advertising dollars on media trying to reach audiences that people don't normally reach. So the reason I addressed you as professor is, can you, for a few minutes, go back to your old role with the experience you have now and talk about advertising and return on investment and lessons learned, and you've had a chance to use the internet and all these different forms. So what kind of things would you tell your future students? And by the way, I'm also friends with Jay Matlin, so I may get him to fill out an evaluation form.
Well, just a couple of thoughts that are random firings in my brain, I guess. The use of advertising for sample surveys doesn't occur, really, if you think about it. We don't do that now. There are some local area studies that have dense enough sampling that it pays to do advertising. So, for example, the Framingham Heart Study, do you remember this? And studies like this, so-called city studies, often have some sort of PR attachment to it to tell people that this study is going on, it's a good thing, cooperation is a useful thing. But sample surveys, other than those, really don't do advertising, and it doesn't pay to do it. So the return on the investment of advertising when you're sampling only, say, 1 in 10,000 households, it's hard to make that case, right? A census is so radically different from that because everyone is the target audience, and you can, in a way that I can't find an analog of, maybe there is some other advertising that goes this way, where you want to tailor your message to every group that has their own media outlet. So the targeting of this is really quite interesting. It was geekily done. We had statistical models that basically estimated the probability that you would return the mail questionnaire based on 2,000 data, based on all sorts of attributes. These are pretty dense data sets. We learned that there are some groups that respond at very high rates in the past, some at very low rates. Those that responded at low rates became disproportionate targets of the advertising. Then we asked the question, if we wanted to target them, how would we target them? What media do they consume? That actually led to some groups almost dropping out because they didn't have an organized media where they represented a dense enough audience that we could target them. Others, it led to the use of media that I didn't know about, okay, as the ex-professor, and that is really small newspapers, radio stations in language that have a very small reach but have a loyal audience where people are listening to it throughout their workday. They believe the disc jockeys, and that it is a trusted voice on its own. And then the use of these partners, and I think I've said it, but I want to say it very clearly. My hunch is that the advertising without the partners wouldn't have worked. You have to think of that as an integrated set of messages. So when the local partners, when the imam in the mosque 2 blocks away from my house used the same words that the Arabic radio station used, that we paid for the advertising, then it worked, right? They were getting the same message, same words, same reasons. When that was integrated, that really worked well. The partner notion is threatened in sparsely populated populations. So in rural areas, deep in Montana, there are not social organizations that represent the people. People live far away from one another. It really works in densely filled urban areas where social organizations are rich and vibrant, and that worked well. So those are my random thoughts.
Dr. Gross, I actually have the mic, and I would like to ask you a question about working with agencies. So you had agencies of record. Can you share a bit about how the census partnered with Draft CB and I think Global Q?
Yeah, I'm not actually the best on this.
Okay.
So, when I arrived, the plan was set. The plan is a consortium of 20 to 30 organizations that many of the agencies are tailored to particular ethnic groups. They knew the media. There was a component in terms of integration. There were PR activities separate from paid media activities. The PR activities involved what we called a road tour. We had 13 vehicles traveling all over the country. There were these kind of vans that stuffed in the van was a whole, tent-like structure, and we gave out census goodies to get the word out. These vans were all over the place. So these vans went to NASCAR events and the Super Bowl and the Final Four, as well as the Chinese festival in some little town, right? They were all over the place, and we got good response from that PR side. The media, I learned one other thing about this, and that is you can never spend enough money on the media. So all of the ethnic groups probably ended this saying, you know, if you'd only spend a little more money in this outlet, we would have done better in the census, and why didn't you do that? Eventually you run out of money, and we tried to make every one of our buy decisions had numbers behind it. We had the payoff, which was a function of their prior participation rates. We were tracking the impact on the groups, and then we had media audience estimates, and that was the complex. These were pretty objective as much as we can decisions.
Can you talk about the Super Bowl ad?
The Super Bowl ad was the most controversial part of the advertising campaign. So this was it at the beginning of the second half? I can't remember. Was it?
Beginning of the third quarter.
Beginning of the third quarter. It was heavily critiqued by some folks, and by other folks they said, oh, I really liked it. It was a humorous ad. I must admit, I should take some blame for the humor. When I looked over the first advertising, I said, geez, are we not using humor at all as a way to do this? So that was the result, I guess, of my question. The interesting thing about that ad is that it produced stories weeks after the Super Bowl. So there was, on the style section of the Washington Post, there was a full page. The front page was all about that ad. I don't know anything about advertising, but I'm told that when an ad is really, really bad and it gets pressed for a long time, people remember it. At that phase, our goal was very simple, to tell people that the census was coming. And some that look at the glass half full about that ad said, well, they're still talking about that ad. That has to be good for us. I have no empirical data to say that was good for us. I do know that they were still talking about that ad for some time afterwards.
Okay, we'll take the final two questions.
You mentioned, and I thought it was almost like a throwaway, and I paraphrase, the rich are getting richer, basically. Could you elaborate a little bit about that, because I didn't catch the numbers?
Okay, this is a phenomenon that started about 15 years ago. The concentration of income in the highest income groups. And so the graphs I showed you showed that increasing concentration. So the separation from the richest rich from the rest of us, and certainly from the poorest poor, is taking place. That's not a new phenomenon. It's a phenomenon, I included that slide because I think it has impact on the advertising community. The concentration of wealth means that those who have more of the discretionary assets are a smaller number of people than they used to be. And so targeting the richest rich, you're increasingly targeting a smaller and smaller group, and the impact on the bottom end is the complement of that. So it's a phenomenon that the society pays attention to every once in a while. It's certainly changed over the last 20 years, and it's something economists talk about a lot.
As a statistical analysis expert, how would you rate the census capability, and did you use outside consultants or providers to give you a hand?
Well, first of all, no one does. There's no competitor for the decennial census, so it's kind of hard to know. The Census Bureau is best in class by definition, since no one else does a decennial census. But I know that isn't what you meant. We use a lot of consultants. So when I came in, we brought in a team of folks who had prior census experience. but we're also using a lot of consultants on examining our current sample surveys. So we use a lot of IT consultants. It is important, I believe, for an organization as big as the Census Bureau to constantly open up itself to ideas from the outside. Like any very big organization, it's easy to think of your capabilities as self-sufficient, that you actually don't need advice. We have structured advisory committees that give us advice. We are overseen by 2 oversight committees on the Hill, by the Government Accountability Office, by the Inspector General, by the National Academy of Sciences. We are talking to outside people always, and they are very free with their frank observations about our performance. We appreciate that. It helps us become better.
One more?
One more.
Internet research.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're feeling really good and smart that you had parallel studies that you could do the dailies and see how things are going. Regarding the internet stuff that wandered away, any takeaways from that about internet research and future using this, or just anything to sort of share with the audience about doing internet studies?
Let me say a couple of things. As you know, as you imply, there was no 2010 internet option for part of the production. One of the things I changed when I came in was to add an internet test that will actually start in August. We're going to ask a sample of folks to refill out their form on the internet that have already mailed it back or had a in-person interview. The purpose of that is to really study response differences. It won't be a response rate study. We won't ask the question, do higher proportions of people respond on the internet? That will feed the evaluation of 2010. We are mounting a large internet test on the sample survey that I call the American Community Survey, this ongoing survey. And then it is pretty easy for me to say the 2020 census will have an internet option. The hard thing is for any of us to imagine what the internet of 2020 will look like. I mean, no one has any idea what the internet of 2020 will look like. So the wisdom that is required of the Census Bureau in planning the next census is trying to wait the optimal amount of time before you pull the lever on the internet version of, that would be used in 2020. If we designed an internet application for 2020 now, I guarantee you that you would write stories about how stupid the Census Bureau is in choosing this old-fashioned internet option. How stupid could they be? On the other hand, there's intense pressure externally for certainty about the 2020 census. There are inquiries already that we get about how much will it cost? What will it look like? We're 10 years out now, right? But for budgeting purposes and others, there's a lot of interest in reducing the uncertainty. Tell us exactly what it's going to look like. We have to resist that. Now, the final thing I want to talk about the internet, the data from around the world are pretty clear on this, I believe, that this will not be a panacea. Offering the internet in 2020 will not mean, you know, it becomes almost free, everyone will do the internet option. The results from surveys when you give people options of what mode to do is that the internet is just one of another mode. It doesn't necessarily increase the response rates for all survey requests. Some people choose it because it fits their lifestyle, but it doesn't mean you've solved your response rate problem in any ways. And then there's this other fascinating finding, now been replicated 5 times in several countries of the world, that if I give you 4 ways of doing a survey, I'll say 1, 2, 3, 4, you choose. I don't care what you do. You choose which one you want. That act of choice reduces the overall response rate. It is as if the choice itself becomes a burden, and the overall response rate goes down when you give people many alternatives. So we are at the beginning of what some in my field call multi-mode surveys. How to set those things up right in a way to be cost efficient and get good measurement, we don't know yet. And we all are learning around the world as we put these together.
Well, I'd like to say thank you so much to Dr. Gross for his time. I'd like to thank all of you for coming and asking your thoughtful questions. And on behalf of the Advertising Research Foundation, on the eve of our 75th anniversary, we are very honored to have this discussion, and we look forward to continuing it next year, as we know that the multicultural is becoming the mainstream.